For 18 months, I quietly funded my son's dream home while his wife bragged that they were self-made. Then she humiliated me at the housewarming. She thought I'd leave quietly and disappear, but she had forgotten one crucial detail: the house was never truly theirs. Chapter 1. The porcelain pitcher. The kitchen smelled of warm cider and dried rosemary as Clara set the stoneware pitcher on the wooden counter. At 64, her hands were steady, carrying the weight of 4 decades of tending a garden that stretched down to the Ohio riverbank. I wore my usual faded cardigan, the elbows patched with dark wool, a uniform of quiet labor. Across the breakfast island, my son Callum stirred sugar into his mug, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his phone. "Sloan wants everything moved by Thursday." Callum said, his voice dropping an octave as he avoided my gaze. "The contractors are finishing the floors in the sunroom, and she needs the extra chairs from your porch." I did not answer immediately. I poured hot water through the tin strainer, watching the leaves unfurl in the brown ceramic pot. This was the 3rd time this week Sloan had rearranged our schedules, without asking, treating my porch like an off-site storage unit for her grand housewarming party. Sloan, 32 and fiercely protective of her carefully curated suburban image, had spent months orchestrating the purchase of the colonial home on Elm Street. To Sloan, older things and older people cluttered the narrative of sleek success she wanted to project to her corporate colleagues. "Tell her the porch chairs stay where they are," I said, evenly, setting the teapot down. "They need the shade before the frost sets in, and they don't belong in a modern sunroom." Callum sighed, a sharp, tired sound that signaled he was caught between 2 worlds he no longer knew how to navigate. "Mom, please, just this once. It's her big debut in the neighborhood. You know how much pressure she's under with the new mortgage." I looked at my son, noting the graying temples that had appeared too early. I said nothing more about the chairs, but a quiet, firm resolve settled in my chest. I would go to the party as requested, but the rules of engagement had quietly shifted. Chapter 2. A blueprint of dismissal. The routine of exclusion had been built brick by brick over the last 6 months. It started with casual changes to dinner plans, shifted to uninvited redecorations of the heirlooms I had given them, and culminated in the meticulous guest list for the Elm Street housewarming. I drove my station wagon down the maple-lined streets on Saturday afternoon, the engine humming a steady, familiar tune. I carried a basket of preserved crab apples, wrapped in simple linen, hoping to offer a traditional housewarming gift. When I stepped through the wide double doors, the air smelled of fresh paint, expensive diffuser oil, and nervous ambition. Sloan stood by the quartz island, directing 2 caterers in matching black aprons. She wore a cream-colored cashmere dress that seemed entirely too formal for a crisp autumn afternoon. "Clara," Sloan said, her greeting lacking any warmth as she took in my sensible walking shoes and gardening jacket. "You're early. And, oh, please tell me you didn't bring that sticky jar inside. The counters are Italian marble. I told everyone to be careful." "It's just preserved fruit from the South Orchard," I replied, keeping my voice level as I set the basket down on a side console. Sloan didn't touch the basket. Instead, she turned to Callum, who was busy uncorking wine bottles nearby. "Callum, didn't you tell your mother about the color palette? That red jar completely clashes with the minimalist gray tone we're going for in the foyer." Several early guests, colleagues from Sloan's marketing firm, glanced over from the living room, their expressions a mix of polite curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. I watched the subtle interplay, Callum's shoulders hunching defensively, Sloan's posture stiffening like a guard dog at a gate. Before I could respond, Sloan pointed toward the front door. "There's no place for you here, Clara. Please leave." Callum lowered his eyes and said nothing as the room fell silent. I left, without a word, stepping back out into the cool autumn air. This was not an isolated misunderstanding. It was a deliberate performance of separation. Sloan wanted a clean break from her husband's working-class roots, framing me not as family, but as an aesthetic liability to be managed hidden or eventually locked away entirely from their new social reality. Chapter 3. The Shift in the Greenhouse. The morning after the party, the frost bit hard at the window panes of my small, heated greenhouse. For 30 years, this glass and wood lean-to had been my sanctuary where I propagated heirloom tomato seeds and wintered delicate geraniums. Usually by 9 o'clock, Callum would drop by for his second cup of coffee and help load the heavy bags of mulch from the delivery truck. At 9:30, the driveway remained empty except for a stray blue jay pecking at frozen berries. I did not wait. Instead of prepping the extra flats of winter greens that I usually gifted to Callum's household, I packed them into boxes and loaded them into my own trunk, driving them directly to the community center downtown. For the first time in 5 years, I canceled the standing Sunday dinner reservation I always hosted at my kitchen table. When Callum called at noon, his voice sounded rushed and slightly bewildered. "Mom, are you coming over? Sloan made a pot roast and we have leftovers." "No, Callum," I said, clipping a dead stem from a prized begonia with surgical precision. "I have my own garden work to finish today. I won't be making the drive over." "Oh, well, Sloan was hoping you could help clean up the back patio. The caterers left some crates out there." "I am no longer in the patio clearing business," I replied calmly. The silence on the line was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic on Route 4. Callum didn't press further, but I could hear the gears turning in his head. It was a tiny fracture in their decades-long routine, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to me, it marked the exact moment the heavy iron gate of my availability swung shut. I was reclaiming my hours, my soil, and my peace, leaving the young couple to contend with the messy reality of keeping their own immaculate house without my invisible labor. Chapter 4. The Ledger on the Desk. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected chore that forced me into the practical details of my family's financial entanglements. Sitting at my roll-top desk, I sorted through the semi-annual tax documents for the small woodlot parcel adjacent to my property land, tied to a loan I had co-signed for Callum 2 springs ago when the bank balked at his baseline credit score. The paperwork lay flat under my reading glasses, a reminder of the quiet financial scaffolding I had provided to ensure my son could secure his house without drowning in predatory interest rates. Sloan had often bragged to her friends about their self-made mortgage rate, conveniently omitting the fact that my spotless credit history and secondary equity pledge were the silent engines keeping the bank's underwriters quiet. I traced the signature line with my thumb, noting the date of the next escrow review. It fell precisely on Friday, just 3 days after the housewarming disaster. My phone buzzed against the blotter. It was a text from Callum with a photo of a broken sprinkler head in the new front lawn. "Hey, Mom, do you remember which irrigation contractor you used for your irrigation system? Sloan is freaking out because the sod is flooding." I stared at the screen for a long moment. I thought of the way Sloan had pointed toward the door at her housewarming party, the public humiliation masked as interior design preference, and the total lack of grace from a woman who built her entire illusion of independence on borrowed credit and maternal safety nets. Instead of replying with a phone number, I opened my email. Client drafted a formal message to our family attorney and requested a complete review of my financial obligations tied to the Elm Street property. The foundation was strong, but only because I had poured the concrete. It was time to check if the structure could stand when I withdrew my financial support. Chapter 5. The Threshold of Dignity. The afternoon sun cast long, cold shadows across the cedar deck as I sat with a cup of chamomile tea watching the finches fight over thistle seeds. The emotional sting of Saturday's public dismissal had faded into something much sharper and more useful, absolute clarity. I realized that by softening my edges to accommodate Sloane's fragile insecurities, I had only invited disrespect. My mind wandered back to my late husband, Thomas, who had always taught me that a fence was built not to keep people out, but to define where one's responsibility ended and another's began. For years, I had crossed my own fences to coddle Callum, smoothing over his lack of backbone and absorbing Sloane's passive-aggressive barbs under the banner of keeping family peace. The front gate clicked. Callum walked up the gravel path, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, looking smaller than his 34 years. He didn't knock. He just let himself in through the unlocked screen door, bringing the scent of stale gasoline and cold asphalt with him. "Sloane is upset," Callum said without preamble, dropping onto the wooden bench opposite her. "Wait, opposite me. He says you've been ignoring her texts about the leftover folding chairs." "I haven't ignored them, Callum. I've simply decided not to answer," I said, my voice calm and low. I did not rise to offer him tea. Callum rubbed the back of his neck, looking around the cluttered sunlit kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. "She's just stressed, Mom. It's the new neighborhood. The neighbors are all high-profile corporate types. She wants everything to look effortless." "Effort is never effortless, Callum," I replied, setting my mug down with a soft click. "And pretending I don't exist in public isn't stress. It's a choice. You stood right beside her and watched her point to the door. You chose silence then. Don't come here now asking me to fill the silence for you." Callum flinched, the words landing with the weight of a dropped anvil. For the first time, he had no ready excuse, no comforting platitude to smooth over the jagged edges of his wife's cruelty. Chapter 6. Redrawing the boundaries. By Wednesday evening, my plan was fully mapped out on a yellow legal pad. I didn't rely on dramatic outbursts or impulsive threats. I operated with the cold, unyielding logic of a woman who had managed a farm through 3 bad droughts. First, I called our family attorney to discuss modifying the property agreements tied to the Elm Street purchase. Second, I reviewed the original equity distribution documents from 18 months prior, noting my legal standing as a primary investor and co-signer on the underlying asset structure. The arrangement was clear. As the primary backer who funded the substantial equity portion of the purchase, my continued involvement was contingent upon a valid, respectful family framework. Sloane's blatant disrespect at the housewarming party, witnessed by multiple guests, made it clear that my support was being taken for granted, while my personhood was rejected. I drafted a formal notice of restructuring with my attorney's guidance, signed it with a steady hand, and prepared the final legal filings for Thursday morning. The law was as straightforward as a well-drawn property line, and the house itself had been acquired using a private family trust note where I held the primary lien. I spent the remainder of the evening removing the remaining spare keys to my own house that hung by the pantry door, including Callum's and Sloane's. I placed them inside a small velvet pouch and set them squarely in the center of my kitchen table. The house felt quieter tonight, stripped of the obligation to please people who regarded my existence as an inconvenience. I brewed a pot of mint tea, sat by the wood stove, and watched the embers glow in the dark iron box. The structure I had built to protect my family was still standing, but the door was no longer unlocked for those who forgot how to knock with respect. Chapter 7. The Miscalculation. Sloane sat at the Marble Island on Thursday morning, scrolling through her phone while sipping a latte from her favorite ceramic mug. She felt a quiet sense of triumph. 3 days had passed since she unceremoniously banished me from her housewarming party, and the old woman had retreated into her rural shell without making a scene. Sloane figured her strategy had worked: firm boundaries, absolute modern polish, and zero tolerance for out-of-touch relics. Her phone rang harsh and sharp against the quiet kitchen. The caller ID displayed the direct extension of our family attorney, Mr. Harrison. Sloane swiped to answer, expecting a routine verification for the final patio landscaping invoice. "Mrs. Miller," a brisk professional voice inquired. "This is Thomas Harrison. I'm calling regarding the formal restructuring of the Elm Street property lien." "Yes." Sloane frowned, her chest tightening slightly at the formal tone. "Is there an issue with the transfer?" "We have received instructions from Mrs. Clara Miller to execute a formal notice of asset recall and lien enforcement on the property pursuant to the default provisions of our private funding agreement." The attorney continued calmly. As a result, your primary funding backing has been officially revoked, and the title deed is reverting to sole primary control. You have 48 hours to contact our office to discuss your occupancy status. Sloane's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the hard quartz counter, before sliding to the floor with a hollow plastic thud. Asset recall. Sole primary control. The reality of her precarious financial footing rushed in like freezing water. Without my invisible backing, the glittering facade of their suburban dream home was nothing more than a house of cards built on sand about to collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. Callum walked through the front door at 6 o'clock that evening, expecting the usual smell of takeout and Sloane's complaints about the landscaping contractor. Instead, he found his wife sitting on the floor of the foyer, her face buried in her hands, dry sobs shaking her shoulders. The formal legal notification letter from the attorney lay open on the console table, its official seal glaring under the recessed lighting. "What is this?" Callum asked, picking up the paper. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, the bold red warnings, and the stark reality of the revoked funding line. Sloane. "What did you do?" "It's your mother." Sloane choked out, her voice sharp with sudden panicked fury. "She's taking the house back. She's trying to destroy us just because I told her she didn't belong here during the party. She's vindictive. She's—" "Stop it!" Callum shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden violent intensity that startled them both. He had spent years playing the peacemaker, absorbing the blows, tiptoeing around Sloane's vanity, and excusing her blatant disrespect. But seeing the official notice bearing my name shattered the illusion of his safe neutrality. "My mother didn't destroy us, Sloane. You did. You humiliated her in front of everyone. You threw her out of your house like a piece of old furniture, and you expected her to just swallow it and keep funding your lifestyle." Sloane stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, as she realized her husband was no longer her shield. The illusion of complete control evaporated in Smitio, the cold draft of the open front door. "You have to call her," Sloane whispered, her arrogance completely dissolved into sheer, unadulterated terror. "You have to go down there and beg her to fix this. If she takes the house, we lose everything." Chapter 9. The Conditions of the Threshold. The rain drummed a steady, unforgiving beat against the roof of my porch when a car door slammed in the driveway. Headlights swept across the frosted living room windows. I didn't look up from my knitting. I had expected them within the hour. Heavy, hurried footsteps crossed the gravel, followed by frantic knocks on the front door. When I didn't move, the knob rattled violently before Callum's voice rang out thick with desperation. "Mom, please open the door. We messed up. Mom, please." I set my knitting needles down, walked slowly to the heavy oak door, and turned the deadbolt. I pulled it open just enough to reveal my calm, unreadable expression. Callum stood under the porch light, soaked and shivering, while Sloane lingered a few steps behind him in the dark, her face pale and tear-stained. "Mom," Callum breathed, his voice breaking. "The attorney. They're taking the title back. We need you to cancel the notice. Please." I looked past my son to the woman who had pointed me toward the door just 3 days earlier. Sloane could barely meet my eyes, her lower lip trembling as the reality of her vulnerability set in. "You told me I didn't belong there, Sloane," I said, my voice steady and clear against the sound of the rain. "And as it turns out, your house has no foundation without the very person you tried to erase." "I'm sorry," Sloane whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I was arrogant. I was cruel. Please, don't take the house away." I didn't gloat, nor did I deliver a long, vindictive speech. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a single typed sheet of paper containing the revised terms of the property agreement. "I will halt the recall," I said quietly, "on 3 strict conditions. First, you will formally apologize to my face without excuses. Second, the deed will be amended to name me as a legal co-owner, so my investment is never hidden again. And third, Callum spends every weekend this month helping me clear the south pasture, without exceptions. Callum nodded instantly, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. Sloane swallowed hard, bit her pride, and slowly stepped forward onto the porch, bowing her head in the cold autumn air. Chapter 10. The New Foundation. The morning sun broke through the gray November clouds, casting a golden light across the frosted glass of my greenhouse. The crisis had passed, resolved not through spite or dramatic ruin, but through the unyielding application of boundaries and self-respect. The legal paperwork had been refiled, the deed amended to reflect my proper stake. And the Elm Street house remained standing, not as a monument to Sloane's superficial vanity, but as a shared structure anchored by mutual accountability. Sloane had kept her promise. 2 weeks after the incident, she drove out alone on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying no fancy coffee or corporate excuses. She walked up the gravel path, knocked gently on the screen door, and waited for permission to enter. When I opened it, Sloane handed over a simple jar of homemade jam, her softer posture replacing her glossy exterior. We sat on the porch in silence for 20 minutes, drinking tea without a single word about interior design or social circles. Callum had spent the last 2 weekends hauling timber and clearing brush in the south pasture, his hands blistered and his back aching, finally taking responsibility for the choices he made between his wife and his mother. He was quieter now, more grounded, finally understanding that a real family is built on respect and labor, not on the fragile illusion of perfection. I stood by my garden fence, my hands tucked deep into my wool pockets, breathing in the crisp, clean air of the riverbank. The house across town was still there, but the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I had taken it all back, not to destroy my children, but to teach them that love without boundaries is merely an invitation for disrespect. My life was my own. Again, quiet, sovereign, and deeply rooted in a dignity that no amount of modern polish could ever replace.